It's pitch black outside. The faint crashing of the waves down by the nearby beach can be heard, but otherwise the night is quiet. It's springtime and the weather has started to get milder. It had seemed like a great weekend to go on a quick camping trip and get away from their homes for a bit, but the three boys are all alarmed as they sit up in their sleeping bags. They know they have all woken up from the same sound because they soon hear it again. It's the sound of someone whistling. It almost sounds like someone trying to find their dog, and soon a person does appear in the dark. Anxiously, the three guys get out of their sleeping bags to see what the man needs, but little do they know that within minutes, two of them will draw their final breaths, as their young lives will be abruptly ended by a deranged man full of hatred and anger against everything around him. This is the story of Naum Conevski, a Yugoslavian guest worker in Denmark, who in the early 1980s emerged as the protagonist of a horrible series of events that would lead to a polarizing debate regarding the media's role in criminal investigations. In our last episode, I talked some about a Swedish man named Sture Bergvall, who had been wrongfully convicted of multiple murders, only for the media to later play a pivotal role in his exoneration. Today's episode will offer some similarities to Sture's case, but in some way you can almost say it's the opposite story. While the media came to Sture's defense and fulfilled its important role as a watchdog, when they had Sture's wrongful convictions re-examined and overturned, you will soon learn that the end result in Naum Conevski's story was very different. But before I get started, I want to say thank you just like I did last week. I started this channel only a couple months ago, and I'm happy to see that more than 250 people have now enjoyed my videos so much that they have chosen to subscribe. I hope to make that number at least 500 by the end of the summer, so if you like today's episode, please consider subscribing. It really is the easiest way to support us, and I would be very grateful. For now, let's get on with today's story. Naum Conevski, who I'm just going to refer to as Conevski from this point on, was born on May 13th, 1949, in a town called Ohrid in Macedonia, which was then part of Yugoslavia. But our story doesn't begin until years later, because in January of 1981, Conevski finds himself working as a taxi driver in Copenhagen, Denmark. From 1967 until 1970, it was fairly easy to obtain work permits in Denmark for foreign nationals. Many employers needed more hands, and this led to an influx of guest workers from around the world, especially from Pakistan, Poland, and Yugoslavia. Conevski was one of those people who came to Denmark to find work. After he completed his training as a radio mechanic, he first traveled to Sweden, but then he arrived in Denmark in 1968. He had a wife who was also Yugoslavian, and they seemingly enjoyed a simple and modest life together. But 13 years after first settling in the country, Conevski is one day arrested and charged with rape, aggravated robbery, and theft. Supposedly, on January 14th, 1981, he had assaulted a 42-year-old woman named Gurli in her home in the town of Snekkersten. Conevski's explanation of what happened went like this. After picking her up in his taxi in the Frederiksberg area, they drive north out of the city. She calls him a guest worker several times. Conevski initially believes that Snekkersten is not actually the name of a town, but rather a club in Copenhagen. And Gurli's use of the term guest worker, it feels derogatory to him. Supposedly, she eventually begins to flirt with him, and she even starts to caress his neck from the back seat. And after a 45-minute drive, they arrive at her house. She asks Conevski to join her inside to have sex, but Gurli's own explanation was very different. She explained that when they reached her home, she realized that she didn't have any money on her. So in order to pay for the ride home, she needed to go inside her house so she could write him a check. When she heads inside, Conevski follows her. She hands him the payment and he initially leaves. But when Gurli moments later goes to let her dog out, he suddenly reappears in her hallway. A struggle ensues, which ends with Conevski dragging her to the bedroom, where he proceeds to sexually assault her. Gurli soon files a police report, and after she's able to give the authorities a detailed description of the assailant, Conevski is easily identified as the taxi driver who had taken her home. Over the course of the trial, the court decides to believe in Gurli's explanation of what happened. Conevski is quickly convicted and sentenced to 18 months in prison. He appeals the verdict, but this only leads to his sentence being increased to 2.5 years when he is retried in a higher court. However, Conevski vehemently continues to claim that he's innocent. He explains the bruises on Gurli's body by saying that she had been adamant about giving him oral sex, so eventually he had been forced to push her away. He also feels that the result of the trial had been due to the court playing favorites. Around this time, the widespread opinion of guest workers had begun to shift in Denmark, and Conevski claimed that he had been the victim of a biased process that had favored the Danish woman over him. Unemployment was on the rise in the 80s, and while guest workers had been generally well thought of in the 60s and 70s, this general sense had started to change. There was a growing sense that foreigners were now taking jobs that could have otherwise been held by Danish citizens. So when Conevski starts to speak out about this supposedly unfair trial, the debate surrounding his case bizarrely turns into a question of whether he was simply convicted because he was a Yugoslavian taxi driver. And this brings us to 1982. A couple of journalists from the Danish tabloid Ekstrabladet are attending a seminar. While they're at this event, they randomly meet a lady who's employed by the prison authority. She is the first to tell them about a man from Yugoslavia whom she believes has been wrongly convicted of rape. In fact, this woman feels very bad for him. Like I mentioned, Conevski has seemed genuinely heartbroken by the allegations he has been met with. And after observing how distressed he has appeared in the aftermath of the trial, the woman wholeheartedly believes that he didn't do what he's been accused of. The two journalists from Ekstrabladet are immediately intrigued by this. After all, they are indeed journalists, and they are probably always on the lookout for a good story to tell. It doesn't take long before they agree to meet with Conevski, and when they do, they're also convinced that the man is in fact not guilty. Shortly after, however, Conevski is released before completing the entire 2.5 years he had been sentenced to. The authorities have actually grown so concerned about his mental health that keeping him in prison is deemed unsafe for him. But just because he's free, the journalists are not about to forget the case. They see an opportunity to expose a miscarriage of justice, and they begin to meet with Conevski to learn more about his life. During the months of October and November in 1982, they publish a series of articles on his trial, which solely focus on the points of contention in his conviction. One of the headlines of these articles reads, "Convicted of rape, but he is not guilty." And in this article, they aim to present the trial as a case of a man being the victim of racism and xenophobia. Especially one article published on October 29, 1982 mentions, "The case has always been about whom the jury should trust the most. A 42-year-old Danish woman backed by a psychological advisor and an attorney, or a Yugoslavian guest worker." And with this approach, they managed to emphasize how Conevski had been unfairly treated by the justice system.
Jeg synes, det er politiets fejl. Conevski havde sidste gang en lille skødeskriver, en advokat i Helsingør, der gerne ville ligge i arm med politimesteren og politiet. Han var en udlænding, og der sad en kvinde, der var velfungerende med Pringles-sweater og lækket nederdel. Og så sagde man til dem i retten, "Kære venner, hvem tror I på?" Conevski var opfaren, og hun var velformuleret. Og så behøver man jo ikke gætte længe, hvem folk tror på, når der overhovedet ikke var undersøgt en skid i den her sag. Så der var ikke en kæft, der interesserede sig for den her sag. Og den er jo tæsket gennem politiet og statsadvokaten og hele retssystemet, og folk de sagde bare, gab, det er en fremmedarbejder og en dansk kvinde. På den måde synes jeg, at retssystemet og politiet og små advokater i små provinsbyer, de skal tænke sig godt om.
But the journalists also start to look closer at Gurli herself. They report that neighbors claim that Gurli had often been promiscuous and flirtatious with other people. Supposedly, she's also taking a number of different medications, and she also drinks too much. All of this only serves to question the reliability of her story. With the renewed focus on the questionable details surrounding the man's culpability, Conevski himself is eventually able to bring his case to the authority that handles complaints over past rulings. His conviction is re-examined in February of 1984, and it causes widespread debate in the media when he is actually exonerated and subsequently awarded 240,875 Danish kroner in compensation, which, adjusted for inflation, would equate to more than $110,000 in 2025. With this new development, a man who nearly endured a mental breakdown after being wrongfully accused of an immensely terrible crime had reclaimed some of his honor. Of course, these monetary damages that were paid were merely a band-aid after he had been publicly labeled as a rapist during the trial. But at least he had finally received the official admission that he was indeed innocent. But only 3 months later, the story suddenly takes a very unexpected turn. May 19th, 1984 is a Saturday. 3 friends from a youth club called Stjernen, which means the star, on the island of Amager, have decided to go camping over the weekend at an area called Femøren. They are 20-year-old Enrico Per Nielsen, 16-year-old Brian John Petersen, and 16-year-old Dennis Ruben Andersen. They likely enjoy a quiet evening, taking advantage of the weather growing increasingly more mild as spring turns to summer. But in the early hours of the next day, a tragedy would unfold. Around 2 a.m., the boys crawl into their sleeping bags, but suddenly they hear footsteps nearby. When they look up, they see a stranger approaching. Initially, the man probably doesn't seem intimidating. While it's odd that he's walking upon their campsite in the dark, they quickly remind themselves that while 2 of them are teenagers, there are still 3 of them and only 1 of him. And like I mentioned at the beginning, this man is also leisurely whistling. It sounds almost like the way you would whistle for a dog, but they don't see any dogs around. And that's when they instead see the gun in his hand. A revolver that has a distinctly white grip. 16-year-old Dennis would later explain that the man had proceeded to crouch down next to him and press the weapon against his neck. He tells them to hand over their gun, but the boys don't know anything about any guns, so the man starts to get angry. It had seemed like the stranger had enjoyed taking control of the situation, reveling in their fear, and with all 3 young boys paralyzed in terror, they all remained still, hoping the man would eventually decide to leave them alone. But that's not what happened next. The man orders them to lie flat down on the ground. He then lowers his voice and whispers to them, "Blood is going to flow in the streets. You have a gun that's mine." Still confused by this, the boys try to remain calm, but then the stranger crouches down next to another one of them and presses his own firearm against his temple. And then he asks the boy, "Do you want me to shoot you?" This boy somehow maintains his composure and he coyly responds, "That's up to you." But unfortunately, that's exactly what the man does. With the sound of the gunshot still ringing in his ears, Dennis jumps to his feet. He's distraught, but he snaps out of it and immediately darts off. The stranger fires multiple shots in his direction and he's eventually strafed by a bullet, but luckily he manages to flee, and as he runs away, he can hear the continued sounds of gunshots behind him back at the scene. Later, of course, he would learn that his other friend had been killed as well, as he laid there on his belly, likely begging for his life. At 4:27 a.m., Dennis finally manages to alert the cops. The 16-year-old tells them that the shooter had looked like a foreigner and had spoken with a heavy accent. When the authorities descend on the scene, they find projectiles from a .38 caliber firearm, as well as a knife, which the perpetrator had taken from the boys and used to slice the tires on their bicycles. On the knife, the cops successfully pull a mostly intact fingerprint, and this would obviously be highly relevant when charging someone with the murders, but at first they are unable to match it against anyone in their files. Initially, the cops consider if the killings had been gang-related. The boys were known to frequent an area called Christiania, which is where the majority of drugs were sold at the time. But for a number of reasons, they soon move on from this theory. It seemed clear that understanding the motives behind the attack would enable the authorities to narrow down the list of people who could have committed the murders. But the nature of the crime felt so arbitrary, and the cops really had very little to go on. After doing a forensic analysis of the bullet fragments, they determined the gun had likely been a revolver produced by the maker Colt. They decided to publicize this information in the media, together with the description of the white grip, which Dennis had noticed, and they are soon contacted by a dentist who suspects that the gun may be his. He did indeed own a handgun by Colt, which had a uniquely white grip, but it had been stolen a short time before the murders, and the dentist is also convinced as to who had done it. You see, for a while he had been trying to sell it. One day, a man had dropped by his house and asked to see the gun, and just like the killer from Femøren, this man had looked like a foreigner and spoken with a heavy accent. While the person had decided to not buy the revolver that day, the house was broken into a short while later, and the gun had been among the items that had been taken. At the time of the break-in, witnesses had observed a Mercedes parked outside the dentist's house, and fortunately they had been smart enough to take note of the license plate. The authorities soon determined that the car had belonged to a man whose description seemed to clearly match the person that had wanted to buy the gun, and it also sounded very similar to the description of the killer wanted for the murders at Femøren. And what was the name of this man? Well, I probably don't need to tell you at this point. Naum Conevski. But there was a small problem. The fingerprint that had been lifted from the knife found at the crime scene didn't match Conevski's prints. The cops had his prints because he had been involved in Gurli's rape case a couple of years before, so they were able to immediately run them when they began to suspect the Yugoslavian taxi driver. But when this didn't add up, they really had no tangible proof connecting Conevski to the crime scene. That's why the authorities made a very controversial decision. They ordered that every male guest worker living on the island of Amar at the time had to willingly give up their fingerprints so they could be cross-examined with the prints from the murder scene. It's honestly unthinkable to imagine that such a decision would be made today, and even back in 1984, it caused a lot of debate as to whether this approach was fundamentally racist. The cops defended it, however, by emphasizing that all they wanted to do was to catch the killer. And despite there being descriptions of the person as likely being from Eastern Europe, they indeed summoned all immigrants, including from countries where the people clearly didn't fit the description of the perpetrator. This was likely done in an attempt to make civilians feel like the cops weren't treating anyone differently, but it also meant that the authorities had to take the fingerprints of over 5,000 individuals. And remember, they had to analyze these in a time before computers. But while all this work is being done, the lead investigator on the case is unable to forget about Naum Conevski. The story of him possibly breaking into the dentist's home and stealing a gun that seems to match the one used during the homicides is simply too remarkable, so the investigator makes an unusual decision. He asks the forensics department to run the prints lifted from the knife found at the crime scene again, and when they do, the head of the forensics team makes an embarrassing realization. When they had first examined the fingerprints, they had accidentally flipped them around, so the prints were mirrored. But when they flipped them back around, they easily matched Naum Conevski's prints. They immediately rush to his home to arrest him for the murders, but when they arrive, his apartment is empty. It turns out that Conevski and his family have gone on vacation in his home country Yugoslavia, and they learn that he's planning on returning to Denmark days later. So when his plane touches down, he is immediately arrested at the Copenhagen airport. After he is apprehended, the cops raid his apartment again, where they find a lease to a garage in the city. They search it, and they finally find the murder weapon. It was indeed the dentist's revolver, with the characteristic white grip that had been stolen from his house. Over the next couple of months, a medical examiner determines that Conevski had a personality disorder, but he was still able to stand trial and serve time in prison. So on June 26, 1985, he is convicted to life in jail. The prosecutors emphasized that not only was Conevski guilty of a double homicide, but he had also tried to kill a third person, Dennis. While the investigatory work had begun, an officer from another district had curiously been following the case in the media, because when he learns Conevski's identity as the suspect in the murders, the way he is described immediately makes him think back on a string of cases he had investigated himself between 1978 and 1983. Back then, a taxi driver who had likely been a guest worker had been connected to at least one rape and 3 break-ins against women he had previously given a ride in his taxi. Just to clarify, the rape case was another case than the one that involved Gurli. The perpetrator of these crimes had never been caught, and the sexual assault had been considered a cold case. But when the cops look at whether Conevski may have also been responsible for these crimes, they soon uncover objects at his apartment that were taken during these burglaries. Items like records and cassette tapes. They almost feel like small trophies. This was finally proof that the murders at Femiran had simply been the latest in a series of misdeeds committed by the same person. So when Conevski is convicted of the homicides, he's therefore also convicted of the sexual assault in 1979 and the subsequent break-ins. It had only taken the jury 3 hours to deliberate, and to this day, Naum Conevski is still in prison in Denmark. Conevski's conviction immediately becomes a major story in the media. The tabloid Ekstrabladet had covered his so-called wrongful sexual assault conviction extensively back in 1982, and this had definitely not been forgotten. Back then, their articles had claimed that his trial had been riddled with errors. Like I mentioned earlier, they also very much tried to discredit Gurli's own explanation. One article on October 27, 1982, entirely focuses on how drunk she had been the night of the rape, and they asserted that her addiction to medications would have made her highly unstable when she filed the charges against Conevski. The reporters also printed Conevski's own explanation that he had given to the cops back when he was arrested. And all of this combined offered the idea that Gurli had been deranged and is the one who herself had asked Conevski to have sex with her after they reached her home. The tabloid also reports during this time that Conevski had been on a ride with another woman during the time when Gurli is saying that the rape had occurred, but this woman was never identified. Tragically, when the case was overturned, it meant that it would no longer be possible to challenge it again. After the double murder, Conevski's true culpability is exposed, and Gurley tries to have the authorities take yet another look at the entire matter. She also challenges the monetary compensation that had been paid out to Conevski. But sadly, it was not legally possible to do so. And after months of having to endure the memory of her sexual assault, only for the media to later blast her as unstable, it all got to be too much for her. And eventually, Gurley took her own life. Conevski served the first 3 years of his time in prison at the notorious Hostel Vista facility, where a number of other high-profile inmates to this day are held. But eventually he was declared insane. That means he was transferred to another facility for the criminally ill, and later in 1998 to the St. Hans Hospital in Roskilde outside Copenhagen. After the breakup of Yugoslavia in 1992, Conevski became a citizen of Macedonia. He has several times applied to be transferred back to a prison in his home country, and a Danish delegation actually traveled to Macedonia in 1999 in order to assess whether it would be possible to move him there. But they soon determined that the Macedonian authorities would be unable to provide proper psychiatric support, and because of this, they denied his request. In 2012, however, the authorities decided that it was finally possible to extradite him. But when Dennis, the sole survivor of the attack at Femern, heard about this, he filed his grievances, and this put an end to any dream Conevski may have had of returning home. I'm recording this in 2025. Naum Conevski is still behind bars, and he is now the person who has continuously served the most time ever in a Danish prison. After his trial, his wife moved back to their former Yugoslavian homeland, but supposedly they still talk every week on the phone. Conevski is 76 years old now. That's 60 years older than his youngest victim back in 1984. But despite normally being eligible for parole after serving only 16 years, he has been found unfit to return to society. And given the string of tragedies he left in his wake, perhaps that's understandable. The big question that remains is what makes a person do such horrible things? During the 70s, Conevski seemed to have grown increasingly disgruntled with his life in Denmark. Of course, his feeling of being mistreated due to being a foreigner culminated with his first trial in 1981, but for many years prior, he appeared to have harbored a lot of hatred towards Danish society. It's believed that this resentment made him feel entitled to take what he wanted, and it seems he did just that when he committed his crimes. Supposedly, he grew up as the only boy in a large family. Because of this, he was treated like a golden child. When he started to build his life in Denmark, it was around the same time that people's opinions on guest workers began to shift. So suddenly he was faced with a kind of mistrust that he had never had to deal with before. But of course, this doesn't excuse the horrible decisions he would go on to make. The reporters at Ekstra Bladet, as well as the tabloid itself, didn't have to deal with any legal repercussions after wrongfully believing in Conevski's side of the story. After all, they just reported on the case as they had seen it back in 1982. But I'm sure they had some serious soul-searching to do after it was announced that Conevski was being charged with the murders. It's not like he would have still been in prison if they hadn't written their articles. After all, he had already completed his time in jail when they first picked up his story. In other words, their coverage of his case didn't free him up to kill those two boys in 1984. And that's not why their decision to take his side was so dire. The real tragedy is that Conevski's exoneration led to a woman killing herself after she had been raped in her own home and the public had chosen to seemingly not believe her. This is it for today's story. If you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Like I mentioned earlier, I hope to make it to at least 500 subscribers by the end of the summer, and your support means a lot to me. In the meantime, I will be back in 2 weeks with another case. Thank you for watching.